Welcome to FO Live. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me are two very distinguished guests. Gary Grappo was ambassador to Oman. He is a distinguished U.S. State Department official, or rather retired State Department official. The last job he held was in Jerusalem. He was the head of the office of the Peace Quartet in Jerusalem, number 2 to Tony Blair. And he speaks Arabic, amongst other languages, and understands the history of the region. In fact, teaches a class on the history of the region. The other person is Glenn Carle. Glenn Carle, of course, retired as the Deputy National Intelligence Officer. He worked extensively on terrorism, particularly Islamic terrorism, and he needs no introduction. He is the author of the book, The Interrogator. So, without further ado, tell us, Glenn, what is going on?
Well, that might be an impossible question to answer. No, I think everyone knows that the Palestinians in general, Hamas in particular in this instance, have seething resentments and anger. And Hamas, to pretty much everybody's surprise, launched an attack with at least 1,500 men, combatants, a week ago now, through the wall and the barriers separating the Gaza Strip from Israel, and killed roughly 1,200 Israelis. And now we're seeing a buildup of hundreds of thousands of Israeli soldiers, and it appears that the IDF, the Israeli army, is about to pass into, invade, and occupy Hamas with the stated objective of destroying Hamas as a functioning entity. All
right. Now, Gary, you've lived in the region for years. You've lived in Israel. You know Palestine. What about the latest order of evacuating North Gaza? Paint us what are the consequences of the decision that the Israelis are taking?
Some 12 to 18 hours ago, the Israeli government called on the UN to initiate the evacuation of over 1 million residents of northern Gaza, presumably to southern Gaza, probably tipping off the fact that they intend to concentrate their military efforts in the northern half of the Gaza Strip, which we should add for all of our viewers is only about 140 square kilometers. It's a very tiny patch of land with one of the highest densities of population anywhere on the planet. That's going to be an impossible task, even if the warning had been made a week ago. It's just physically impossible to marshal the resources, the logistics to move that many people and all their personal belongings in such a brief period of time. So it's a real question mark then. What is going to happen when Israel moves in force? I'm talking about the land invasion. The air campaign started immediately after Hamas launched its attacks on southern Israel in the early morning hours of last Saturday local time. And I think to date, Israel has dropped 5,500 pounds, I think, of ordnance on Gaza, and they're only just beginning.
Another point of comparison, as of yesterday, Israel had launched 7,000 rockets from aircraft, I think, and possibly from artillery also, but I think it's mostly aircraft, into Gaza in the previous 5 days. And in the entire Libyan intervention of NATO, NATO only launched 6,000 missiles.
Interesting.
So this massive response on the part of Israel and in the land operation, other than perhaps some special forces, as far as I know, really has not yet begun in earnest. I suspect within the next 24 to 48 hours, we'll see the initial thrust of the Israeli ground force.
All right. So we'll come back to this issue in a bit. Let's park this for a bit. Let's take a step back and let us examine the problem itself. So, Gary, you teach a class on this. Tell us about Hamas. What is this beast? What is this organization? What is this elected organization as per some?
Hamas is an Islamist resistance organization. In fact, Hamas is an acronym for its full name in Arabic, the Islamic Resistance Movement. It was founded in around 1987. They published their constitution or covenant, which I will say, by the way, is available online for anyone who wants to read it.
I've read it, Gary. You gave me homework and I read it.
And it's relatively brief, but it's very explicit in its objectives. And it was founded because, if you recall, that was right at the end of the first Intifada.
Correct.
And the PLO was then recognized by many parties outside.
Very quickly, let me interject. The PLO means the Palestinian Liberation Organization. It was headed by Yasser Arafat. It was left-leaning. It was also a terrorist organization in some ways. In Munich, for instance, they were involved in taking hostage Israeli athletes and killing them. But over time, they evolved into more of a political organization. They launched a mass movement called the Intifada. And in that Intifada, Hamas was born. Over to you, Gary.
Yeah. And so one of the marks that differentiates Hamas from its, by the way, Hamas is principally based in and governs Gaza. They ousted Fatah or the PLO in 2007 and are the effective governing authority in Gaza. But in 1988, the PLO was seen as more of a secular organization, and the need was seen on the part of the founders of Hamas to establish an Islamist resistance or opposition organization, and thus we have Hamas born, and it advocates armed resistance. The PLO, particularly as we moved into the so-called peace process years of the late 1980s and early 1990s, began to eschew violence and sought to achieve their objectives of a Palestinian state, independent Palestinian state, through peaceful means, i.e. negotiation and diplomacy. Hamas has always subscribed to violence, has never departed from that. And as we can see today, given the events of almost the last week, they've more than fulfilled their operational objective. And they're pretty uncompromising. They have said from the very beginning, I should back up for a moment and say that Hamas is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in the 1920s by Hassan al-Banna, who is still considered, he's long ago deceased, but still considered to be sort of the paragon of the Islamist movement.
So he's the father of the modern political Islam that we see today. He's the political Islamist fountainhead.
Yes. And maybe seen as less violent, but he also was one of the first to introduce this concept of moving the idea of jihad from spiritual jihad to actual actionable physical jihad, i.e. the employment of violent means in order to achieve their objectives. And Hamas is subscribed to this in its entirety. The employment of violent means in order to achieve, first of all, to achieve the obliteration of the Jewish state, Israel. They
Sorry, Glenn?
Well, I was being ironic. I shouldn't interrupt. No, please go ahead.
They even quote Hassan al-Banna to that effect right at the beginning of this covenant that I referred to earlier.
So tell us what is in the covenant. You've referred to it a couple of times. So walk us through what is it that they promise in the covenant, what is their ideology, and what is the world they want to create?
It's really an extraordinarily good question, Atul, because when you read this document, and you don't necessarily need to be an expert on this part of the world or Islamist political thought, but when you read it, it's full of references to the natural order of things being under Islam, starting most especially with the land of Palestine, but all the lands of the Arabs, all of it. So they really want to rid the lands of the Arabs, first and foremost, from Jews. There are a number of references to crusaders, which there is their euphemism for Christians, but also communists, capitalists, and so forth. And if you listen to some of the early recordings of the founders of Hamas, they really don't limit their ambitions to either Palestine or the Arab world in general.
So you're talking about Sheikh Yassin, in particular, the blind founder,
the so-called blind sheikh and the founder, but there were co-founders as well. I'm thinking of Mahmoud Zohar, who talked about Islam being the natural order of things, not only for Arab lands, but for the entire world. Now,
if I could,
they pretty much have confined their efforts to Palestine. Glenn?
Yeah, I think you touched upon two thoughts that came to mind as you're summarizing what Hamas is. You mentioned jihad, and all of us have, almost anyone will have some passing sense of what jihad is. But I think often people may imagine that it is simply, quote, resistance, unquote, to oppression. There's some specific grievance. And that's true, but insufficient as the explanation. And that leads to the second point that you were discussing, which is the impossibility of separating religion from politics in the traditional Islamic conception of the world, from which the jihad, as we have all had to cope with it, comes. So that it's a much, as you were just talking about, it's a much broader obligation for any Muslim. Now you can get into all sorts of interpretations and arguments about what that implies and obliges for someone to be a good Muslim, but the inseparability of Islam from secular life, from politics, is fundamental to this, and this conservative interpretation of Islam has been in the ascendant for decades, and thus Hamas's interpretation for me, I haven't focused in my career. I didn't focus specific on Israeli-Palestinian issues or Hamas, but have tried to look at Hamas, how it fits into what's going on in Islam and then in the world. And it is, as you said, Gary, it has supplanted through violence and strong arm tactics, but also in an ideological victory in many ways. The secular Palestine Liberation Organization and resistance movements against, be it colonialization, neocolonialization, or Israel or the West. And so Hamas seems, from my perspective, to be a particularly significant manifestation of what all of us and the whole world have had to attempt to cope with, respond to, for the past, really, we're in 2023, 50 years anyway. You can go back much further than that. So the inseparability of Islam, the mandate of Islam to extend and to be dominant in this interpretation of Islam are central to the generation of Hamas, which has a specific focus on the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
All right, so gentlemen, now that you have tied Hamas to political Islam and to Egypt, what are their relations with other countries and other organizations? We hear that they are connected to Iran. We hear that money comes in from Qatar, in particular, to enable them to function. We hear that Hamas has support from Turkey. But I have two experts, and I want each of you to take a crack at this. Paint us a picture.
In terms of the West, most of the major countries have now classified Hamas as a terrorist organization. That includes the United States, the UK, countries of the EU, and a number of others. And at least in the case of the United States, it's been that way for quite some time. In the Arab world, it's very interesting because in some places, the populations view Hamas as this heroic organization that's taken on this military machine of Israel's. But in fact, most of the governments of the Arab world, including in the Gulf, with the one exception you mentioned, do not think highly of Hamas, have no relation with Hamas, and do not welcome Hamas in their country. And that's certainly the case, for example, outside the Gulf in Egypt. In Jordan.
But hold fire, Gary. They do have a relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood. There's a lot of support and sympathy for Hamas in the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, they are an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine.
Hamas does. Not the government of Egypt, though.
No, not the government of Egypt.
Exactly. I agree.
The Muslim Brotherhood controls no country anywhere. But yeah, they are an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been effectively defanged and marginalized in Egypt once al-Sisi took over. So they're not well received in general in the Arab world. I was going to mention in the case of Jordan, there is a political party that is loosely affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, not Hamas, but they are very cautious in the way they interact with the Jordanian government and with other political parties. They have occasionally participated in parliamentary elections.
And I think it's important to note that the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, as a manifestation of it, or in some ways, are hostile to the states, to the Muslim society states, if not directly Muslim governments in the Middle East or in the world, because they are the governments are largely secular, or at least far more secular than is acceptable to the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood and therefore to Hamas. So the governments view them as subversive, and the Muslim Brotherhood and in its certainly more strident elements and Hamas are viewed as a threat and are threats to the governments because they're secular. The Al Qaeda, which is where I spent my days thinking, had a lot of heated discussion between the near enemy and the far enemy. The far enemy was the great imperial power of the United States, or the Western Christian not apostate, kufr states, infidel states, and the near enemy were all of the corrupt, non-Muslim, in the view of the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Al Qaeda, governments in the Middle East, who themselves should be overthrown. So one can understand the lack of affinity or friendliness of the Middle Eastern states for that ideology or any group that tries to embody it.
But they have support from Iran, as Gary, you wrote in your piece, and they seem to have links with other Islamist organizations, including the Shia militia in Lebanon, Hezbollah. Would that be fair?
Oh, yes. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I can't point to a specific time, but for quite a number of years, Iran has been providing funding, support, and most definitely weapons to Hamas, which, just to underscore, is not Shia. It's Sunni.
Yeah.
And the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is a smaller Islamist organization in Gaza, does have a Shia element, but I still think it's majority Sunni because the majority of Muslims in that part of the world are Sunni. Otherwise, if you look at, for example, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, that is a purely Shia organization. They, meaning Iran, tends to direct most of their support, certainly historically, to other Shia organizations. They support a couple of them in Syria. And of course, there is Hamas. So there are about, I'd say, 4 prominent organizations that are funded in some fashion, Hezbollah being the largest by Iran. It's also important to point out that all of these are Arab. And so if you step back and think about what Iran is doing, Iran is Persian. It's a majority Shia nation, although there are certainly Sunni Muslims there.
And they are persecuted. Our viewers should remember that Shias are persecuted in Saudi Arabia and Sunnis are persecuted in Iran.
Yes. But what is most noteworthy, at least in my view, is that Iran is supporting and abetting organizations that are responsible for carrying out violent acts in Arab lands. Now, one interest, one objective, all of these organizations share with Iran is Israel, and by extension, the United States, are the enemy. And it's prompted one, I can't remember who the observer was, to comment that Iran is willing to fight Israel to the last Arab. Because let's keep in mind, the Iranians are not doing the fighting here or dying. I mean, we all know that many, many Hamas fighters have been killed already and likely more to follow. None of these are Persians or Iranians. Ditto in the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Okay, hang on a minute. 2 questions flow from there. Number 1, Iran alone doesn't have that much cash. Much of the budget of Hamas is coming from Qatar, which seems to escape attention. What is Qatar's game plan here?
Qatar has always sought to carve out this extraordinarily unique role in the realm of diplomacy. and that is the party willing to talk to anyone at any time without condition. So if you'll recall, during the days when Afghanistan was much more in the news, they hosted the Taliban, and they even hosted an embassy. I think they were obliged to.
I used to walk by it.
The Afghans to change the name, but it was in effect the Taliban embassy in Doha, the capital of Qatar. They've had a long-running relationship with Hamas and a few other organizations that we, for example, the United States, find quite distasteful. And they all are able to reside there under the proviso that they not carry out their violent activities within the confines of Qatar. And they've largely done that. Now, Qatar has maintained that the funding they provide to Hamas or to Gaza in general, unlike all the other countries in the Arab world who have stopped funding the Palestinians because of the rampant corruption that exists, only goes toward humanitarian or civil purposes. But anyone who is familiar with the way Hamas operates, they are extraordinarily inventive and creative, and obviously can find ways to channel the funding they receive from anyone into their military or political pursuits. And they most certainly have done that. And I personally observed that when I was serving in the Quartet in Jerusalem. And it's a well-known fact among all the intelligence organizations which follow Hamas. So
Qatar has a different agenda and objectives than the Saudis, who are the sort of the big boys in the region, with Iran as the rival, and they're more sympathetic ideologically. The leadership, the royal family in Qatar, to the worldview of the Muslim Brotherhood, while being modernizing and more open to other social changes which would be viewed as decadent and Western by a more purist Muslim Brotherhood adept. And Qatar found itself in the last 40 years with stupendous wealth. I forget the percentages now, but a large percentage of the world's gas reserves are in Qatar. So, and the population is minuscule. I literally drove around the entire country in a day. And there are very few people as you drive around. There's a city and then more or less nothing, a couple of fishing villages, that's all. So, but the royal family has aspirations rising to the level of its wealth in some ways to project its own view of what modern Islam should be, and to be seen as a leader and at least playing an influential role. And it's a way for it providing aid to the Palestinians and to Hamas to challenge the hitherto dominant political, financial and military power and directions of Egypt and Saudi Arabia.
So the Al-Thanis want to take on the Al-Sauds in the never-ending battle of clans for the domination of the Arab world.
Oh, absolutely. Well, an illustrative anecdote, which I'll fudge a little bit. I had a conversation there. I think I've told you this story, Atul.
Yes, you have.
I was chatting with some Qatari women, which was extraordinary by itself, but I'll just go to the main story. And I said naively, but just trying to make conversation, well, I imagine that since culturally, historically, nation states are here, modern artificial constructs, that, you as Qataris are quite deeply interwoven with the Saudis. And the response was, no, those are Saudis, looking down upon them as though they were peasants, desert peasants or whatever. And then the woman said to me, this is literally true. She said, I will tell you the difference between us, the Qataris, and the Saudis. If you wanted a Qatari woman, if you wanted one of us, $20,000. If you wanted, no, if you wanted a Saudi woman, $20,000. If you wanted one of us, $80,000. So there's no love lost among the elites necessarily.
I presume you neither spent $20,000 and you certainly didn't spend $80,000.
My response was, well, suppose I wanted 4 Saudi women instead of 1 Qatari woman. But no.
Well, so much so for the great love between the Qataris and the Saudis, and the Al Thanis and the Al Sauds. So the question I have for you, both of you, is what role is Turkey playing? It's also a non-Arab power. It's a former imperial power until the British and the French carved up the Middle East thanks to Sykes-Picot. And it is a resurgent politically Islamist power under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's just won yet another election in 2023. So what is Turkey doing, especially with its posturing in favor of Palestinians? And also, it has launched relief ships to Gaza in the past.
My suspicion is they will probably, once they can square it with the Israelis, certainly not in the immediate future, want to provide relief in a similar fashion to Gaza. It's just going to be extremely difficult in the coming days, if not weeks, given the expected intensity of fighting that's going to be occurring there. But yes, the Turkey has been very hospitable, most especially to the Muslim Brotherhood. When they were expelled from Egypt in 2013, when al-Sisi took over, they had to decamp at least their principal leadership, many of their followers, and anyone else who could manage to escape. And they were accepted in Turkey. Some went to Qatar and then flew on to Turkey, where they now reside. With Hamas, Turkey has been a little more arm's length, but not completely. I, for a fact, don't know what kind of funding they may have extended to Hamas. They have to be very, very careful, obviously, because they're a NATO member nation, and virtually all the members of NATO have declared Hamas a terrorist organization, and therefore there is a penalty, i.e. sanctions to those who truck with Hamas in any fashion. But it's certainly no mystery that there are sympathies among the Turkish leadership for Hamas, and speaking more broadly, for the Muslim Brotherhood.
All right, so now let's go back to the geography of Gaza. It's on the Mediterranean. It's a narrow strip. 3 sides, or 2 sides of it are Israelis. The southern bit, tiny bit, is Egypt, and 1 side is Mediterranean. So, and it's one of the densest places on the planet. Where does it get its food? Where does it get its money? Where does it get its water, power? Where does the sewage go? How does how does the Gaza Strip exist? How do people there exist?
Well, we've referred to some of the ways in which Hamas has secured funding. The principal benefactor, of course, being Qatar. For a while, there had been other Arab countries, but that's all dried up. Very, very few countries, to my knowledge, provide funding to Hamas at all. How do they secure their necessary supplies,
water, power? Yeah, basics.
It has to come in through Israel, and there are designated crossings from Israel into Gaza. The Israelis have constructed elaborate screening facilities, and they scanned everything. I visited on a number of occasions Kerem Shalom, which is the southernmost crossing point and one principally designated for goods. And I saw everything from automobiles, furniture, to foodstuffs, to clothing, you name it, going through these massive scanners. These are scanners that are capable of taking container-sized cargo, and they scan them for weapons, explosives, and things of that nature. And
so, just to stop you, things are imported into Israel or made in Israel. They land in Israeli ports or are manufactured in Israel, and then they go via Israel into Gaza. That's what you've... Okay.
That's correct.
But not only. Also, there's a port in Egypt, with the border with Egypt, which is licit, sometimes open, sometimes not. And then where I think we're going is that there's extensive smuggling through an almost infinite number of tunnels, which the Egyptians and the Israelis, despite their best efforts, have found impossible to identify entirely and to suppress.
There are a couple of other crossings from Israel into, in fact, there are three that I'm aware of. The other principal crossing, which was in the north of Gaza, was Eretz, and that was devoted virtually entirely to people. So at times there'd be no one, and at times you'd have people lined up for blocks to cross, particularly when working permits were provided to Gazans to work in Israel. The crossing that Glenn referred to in Egypt is Rafah. It's both goods and people. I'd say principally people more than goods, but goods do cross legally. The problem is that the Egyptians do not have the screening facilities that the Israelis do. And the Israelis have been, of course, not surprisingly, most concerned with what goes into Gaza for fear it would be used against the Israelis. I'll just give you a brief, I'll share with you briefly my experience. We were looking, when I served as head of the Quartet mission in Jerusalem, at trying to increase the amount of various types of goods, illicit goods, going into Gaza from Israel. And the Israelis were willing to accommodate, but not surprisingly, very concerned about these goods being properly screened and then getting to their intended source and use. A lot of construction material would cross over from Israel into Gaza, particularly after eruptions of violence, not of the scale that we're witnessing now, but still pretty devastating in Gaza, and therefore would require a substantial amount of construction goods, concrete, rebar, steel, timber, you name it, in order to rebuild the destroyed parts of Gaza. And the concern was that a certain percentage of those materials would be siphoned off for Hamas's specific purposes, most especially in tunnel construction. And we ended up agreeing on an elaborate monitoring system so that once it had gone through screening at one of the designated crossings and entered into Gaza, that you would have a surveyor. It is not the land surveyor most of us are accustomed to, but those who account for goods that go on board a ship or enter into a warehouse or monitor the transshipment of goods. And in this case, we employed the services Lloyd's of London to monitor these goods as they moved from a crossing point into a warehouse, and they were stored in a secure warehouse. There was security around the warehouse to ensure that nothing walked out. Nevertheless, we began to discover that items managed to disappear. And so it's almost impossible that there will not be a certain amount of
leakage,
movement of these goods into Hamas's hands.
All right. So much so for Hamas.
By the way, just to follow up, the same holds true for fuel and some of the water, not all the water. They do have sewage processing facilities nowhere near meeting the capacity needs of Gaza. And so what is not processed in the sewage facility in Gaza is dumped into the Mediterranean.
How charming. Anyway, importantly, now let's talk about the attack. And here, perhaps, Glenn, with your background in intelligence, you can educate us. Why is it that the Israelis were so caught out? Why was it such a shock to their system? After all, the Mossad has been known to be very good. You have the Israeli Defense Intelligence. You have Unit 8200, their technical intelligence. They had a missile defense system. Israel has had a lot of hype about the professionalism and effectiveness of its military and intelligence services and security services, not just intelligence and military. So what went wrong?
My reaction and explanation, which is I'm inferring, of course I do not know, will whenever I speak about this kind of quote intelligence failure unquote, will just about invariably infuriate a layperson or someone who's close to those who have suffered from whatever failure occurred, and to those who want to hold, as we all should, government officials responsible. I wasn't surprised. I don't think that the investigations that will come will find anything particularly different than the current assessment. There will be details added, but I think we pretty well know. In security, as in intelligence more broadly, one wants to create the image we use, or the simile we use, is that of an onion. So it has multiple layers, because no one layer of defense, be it a wall or a sensor or a human or a radio intercept, will be 100% effective. So if one is 95% effective, but 5% get through, then the next layer, that will be 95% effective, and so on and so forth. However, we're talking about humans, and the single greatest challenge to anyone trying to provide security or to do intelligence work, and here the challenge is the same, is to somehow overcome complacency and inattention. And it is essentially impossible to do at all times forever. I spent days with the United States Marine Corps, which has the responsibility to provide security, physical security, at all of our American facilities outside of the United States. And the trainers there made the point that the greatest challenge they had was in as best they could, having the Marines guard against the slipping of attention that inevitably will occur when one has to be at the peak of adrenaline focus 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for years at a time. So what happened, it seems, in the attack last week by Hamas was a belief, which was not ill-founded, in the capabilities of electronic sensors and automatic machine guns that would go off if there were triggers from emotion and so on, and from the assessments by the analysts of the all-source reporting, which would be human sources and open sources and technical sources, radio intercepts, telephone intercepts, changes in the levels of traffic of communications, as well as physical patterns of movement by people in Gaza itself, and on, that led them, the analysts, to think all is normal, nothing particularly unusual. The second critical point, which invariably happens in a failure of this sort, is the truth. Once an assessment is made and confirmed, that becomes the truth, and then thinking and perceptions start to become rigid. And if some data point doesn't fit into the truth, which I put between quotation marks, which is always obtained there too, it's dismissed as an aberration rather than an alert. Intelligence agencies, I know Mossad does because I've worked with them and they're very good, and I know the CIA does good. Try to create procedures to stop this kind of cognitive bias, these assumptions, and this impossible to avoid complacency from occurring. But it always will. And I could take hours citing almost every intelligence failure fundamentally is the same thing. The Roman general Varus in the Teutoburg forest in the year, I think, 8 AD, had multiple intelligence reports that the Germanic tribes are going to attack. And he dismissed them because he said, our army is strong. These people are just barbarians. We don't have to worry about it. The French and the British had to the day, the war plans of the Wehrmacht in May 1940 and dismissed them because it didn't fit the paradigm that the British and French intelligence services had developed. My colleagues in the CIA and other intelligence agencies had multiple bits of information which alerted us to an imminent attack prior to 9/11. We didn't know exactly the place or the time, just like similarly with Pearl Harbor was the case, but these were not put together and dismissed for the same kinds of reasons. So I think really that's what happened, and I think there's been a change. I'm interested in Gary's thoughts on this in Hamas's modus operandi a little bit. That we have known that they're devoted to the destruction of Jews and of Israel, and that they will conduct various operations. But I don't think that anyone anticipated an assault with 1,500 combatants by breaching a wall, all of whom have been annihilated and who would accept that as serving a larger strategic or emotional purpose. And so I think that's what happened.
Just to pick up on Glenn's well-argued point, the Israelis were intentionally lulled into this state of reduced awareness or inattentiveness by Hamas. If you'll recall, earlier in the summer, Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched a number of rockets into Israel. Now, typically, Palestinian Islamic Jihad follows the lead of Hamas. In this case, they were the lead, and Hamas did not follow. And in fact, it seems that Hamas even reached out to Islamic Jihad and cautioned them against provoking the Israelis, which led the Israelis to think that, well, maybe Hamas, at least temporarily, is turning a page here and is concentrating on improving the really desperate state of the Gazan economy, and therefore is not interested in provoking a conflict with Israel. In fact, they even rewarded Hamas for that behavior by upping the number of work permits for Gazans to enter into Israel and work from 10,000 to 20,000. So if this was intentional on Hamas's part. And so the low level of activity apparently, and this is just coming out now, it even prompted the Israelis to move 3 army brigades from the area around Gaza up towards the West Bank, where they had been facing far more intense activity, violent activity against Israelis, Israeli settlers, and Israeli security forces. So in anticipation, perhaps, of further violence in the West Bank. And that probably explains why so many Israelis were reporting in the first 24 hours of attack, no one's coming to save us. They were locked in their security havens, within their homes, which almost every house in that part of Israel has, expecting that Israeli security would show up within an hour or two to force out the invaders and rescue all these residents in these communities. They never came because they weren't there.
It also seems that that Hamas did an excellent job of targeting at the outset critical communications nodes for the IDF, for the Israeli army and the guards, and that initially the alerts that were sent by guards never managed to get through because the communications node that was central to making that possible had been destroyed. And so you had disaggregated a series of platoons or companies or squads of the Israeli army without any guidance or without any larger picture for a number of hours that happened before. Another point I'd like to add, and this is I'll compare myself to my Mossad colleagues. And an error that I always try not to make, but repeatedly do in my career and life, is to assume more rationality in my target or opponent than in fact is the case, proves to be the case. So Atul, you'll recall you and I were discussing a year and a half ago whether Putin would invade Ukraine. We had to write and opine on that.
December 24th, 2022, we published that piece.
And my statements and what we wrote were Putin can achieve just about everything he seeks to achieve, as best we can understand it, and I think pretty well, without invading.
Yeah, and remember, I assume more irrationality, and I said he could invade. So between the two of us, I deferred to your experience and judgment.
A senseless act for him to invade if he can achieve what he wants to without it, because the consequences for him could be catastrophic. Similarly, I remember being mystified after the United States invaded Iraq when our soldiers continued marching north from Baghdad initially, with the apparent intention of creating an independent Kurdistan. And I have all the sympathy in the world for the Kurds, but I thought this is really, really opening an almost lunatic can of worms. If we are to do that, who would ever think of doing such a crazy thing? And those are just two examples. So I think at the immediate level of analysis, our counterparts in the Israeli services probably made that error too. There are larger strategic objectives, which I think Hamas's attack may well achieve from the attack, which is to at least, I think, disrupt for a unfortunate period of time the real possibility of a Saudi-Israeli peace deal, which could transform the entire Middle East. And for now, the Saudis would be ill-advised to push ahead with that, I think, or feel that they couldn't. I wouldn't necessarily be ill-advised, but I think they probably couldn't. Just as the Israelis, even those opposing an invasion of Gaza, probably feel compelled to do that, given 1,300 massacred Israelis. So I think at the larger level, there are rational reasons for Hamas to have done what it did, hideous as it is. But at one level below that of reasoning, I think it was such a lunatic thing to send 1,500 people who will be annihilated to do what otherwise just gratuitous murder, other than based on hatred, which the Israelis knew about. It didn't make sense, and so it would be dismissed.
So, quick question for both of you. All three of us have been extremely uneasy with the direction Benjamin Netanyahu or Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, has taken. It's a coalition of crazies. He has settled new people in the West Bank. Fanatical settlers have come in, and that increased tensions. That meant that the IDF was in the West Bank. And for those of our viewers and listeners who don't know, the Gaza Strip is along the Mediterranean. It's to the west, and it's divided by Israel, and then the West Bank is to the east, slightly east, and it borders Jordan. The West Bank, bit by bit, has been pockmarked by settlers, and the prospects of a two-state solution, many say, have been, if not completely, but if not completely, then substantially undermined by these settlements. And Bibi's judicial reforms led to 1,000 Air Force reservists and 10,000 Israeli Defense Force, IDF reservists, threatening to go on strike. And this is huge because in Israel, everyone serves, even women. In Israel, people are reservists. In Israel, the IDF is extremely professional. And for the rebellion against Bibi to hit the IDF probably was a signal to Hamas, and also meant that the IDF couldn't keep its full focus on the different strategic challenges. So my question to both of you is, how far do you hold Bibi's policies and the crazy coalition politics of Israel's proportional representation system with lots of different parties, and the threat of strike by IDF reservists responsible for this as well?
I don't think there's any question but that the strike probably had some effect, and it would be very difficult for me to assign a value, but some effect on the readiness of the IDF. You mentioned some of the reservists who have got on strike. And we should also add that quite a few of Israel's cyber and intelligence officers and NCOs are also reservists, and would not have been as tuned into the goings-on as they would be otherwise. It's interesting to note that a poll recently came out, published by the Jerusalem Post, where over 80% of Israelis hold this current government responsible for this debacle. And
I had missed that poll. That's a huge number.
It just came out, I think. I just saw it. And it is a huge number, particularly when you consider, if you know anything about Bibi Netanyahu's career, he's been Mr. Security.
Correct.
He features prominently in every campaign he has ever run. The other thing he's known for is being the survivor. He manages to come back. But
despite corruption, despite
all the problems that he's been hounded by throughout his political career, Bibi finds a way to come back. And so I've never dismissed him. And even now, despite many pronouncement that this is the end of Bibi's political career, personally, I'm not prepared to dismiss it. I do want to point out something that I really think is important today, in that throughout Bibi's career, it's well known he has vehemently opposed the two-state solution, even back in the days when this was seen as viable and quite possible. I'm going back to the mid to late 1990s. He vocally and vociferously opposed the two-state solution. When he came into office, it pretty much characterized all of his administrations. Now, there were occasions when his arm was twisted, mostly by the United States, and he was obliged to make statements that were conditioned in all kinds of ways that indicated his willingness to accept a two-state solution. The most recent being, of course, when former President Donald Trump came up with his great plan for peace in the Middle East, and Bibi signed on to it. Of course, he came up with this very fractured Bantustan-like map for what would end up being the state of Palestine, and Bibi signed on to that for obvious reasons. But for the most part, he has opposed it. So there is a party in Palestine which is in favor of negotiations, which to the large extent has eschewed violence. That's the PLO and Fatah in the West Bank. Bibi has done everything possible to marginalize those organizations in every way possible. The Palestinian Authority effectively has become less of a governing authority in the West Bank than a subcontractor for Israeli security. Mm-hmm. Many people say this.
It also suffers, as we've discussed, Gary, from massive allegations of corruption and nepotism. So it lacks credibility now.
I mean, there are many things wrong, and these have characterized the PLO since the days of Yasser Arafat, and have only worsened over time, particularly as Abu Mazen or Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority and the head of the Fatah party, has become increasingly emasculated in terms of his ability to get anything done. Everything from loss of the funds transfers from the Israelis to the Palestinians to increasing barriers to conducting economic activity. And so the party that has favored negotiation has been marginalized. The party that stands on the side of achieving its goals through violence, Hamas, has been treated as a semi-recognized governing authority by Netanyahu and his governments. I think there have been, I'm trying to recall how many confrontations between Hamas and the Israelis over the course of the last 12 to 15 years. And we're talking about 6 or 7, and this being obviously the most significant, certainly the one with the highest cost in terms of Israeli lives and Palestinian lives. And every single one, Bibi was negotiated with Hamas as though they were a sitting government. Maybe not directly, maybe through the Egyptians, less so through the Qataris, but he treated them as a governing authority with certain abilities to respond to Israeli demands and vice versa. So they were the ones that were looked to as a representative of the Palestinians, whereas the PLO and Fatah in the West Bank were treated as lepers. Principally because if you want to sit down with negotiators, i.e. the PLO or Fatah, you're talking about an independent Palestinian state, which Bibi has never been able to accept. And I don't think he ever will. In fact, it's an obvious statement. So this presents a bit of a conundrum that perhaps Bibi has led Israel to this point where Hamas was able to mount the kind of invasion force that they did. I mean, Glenn mentioned 12 to 1,500, perhaps even more. Whatever it might have been, it clearly exceeded Israeli estimates of what Hamas was capable of. It may have even exceeded, according to some reports we're now seeing, what the Hamas leadership thought they were capable of doing.
I think they were dumbfounded at how relatively easy they found it at first. Yeah. So I read also. This is
I heard that yesterday from a few sources, actually, that Hamas has been surprised by their success, in fact, shocked by their success. Yeah. They didn't expect it.
This is what's happened in Israel and Palestine for the last 23 years. Well, forever, but certainly since 2000 anyway. Since before, because Barak was assassinated in 95, I guess.
Yeah, 93 is the peace process. Yeah. Then Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin actually gets assassinated. Rabin.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
The date doesn't really matter, but every major party who has agency in the Palestine-Israeli issue. It's worse than a Greek tragedy, because in a Greek tragedy, one can struggle against one's nature, but is doomed to fail because of one's nature. And in this instance, the parties have been actively, whatever the flaws of their natures, have been acting actively, bad English, but to undermine what they may sincerely wish, with the exception of Netanyahu, meaning that the PLO had a peace agreement which Arafat couldn't bring himself to sign, and then their corruption has undermined their legitimacy. Hamas is very corrupt, totalitarian, has another agenda than reaching a peace agreement. And the government of Netanyahu, as Gary clearly said, has never really wanted an agreement, but wants to ensure Israeli security by keeping any potential hostile party less powerful and disaggregated and so on, which adds up to and the Egyptians and other Muslim states, Arab states, have never really been particularly sympathetic to the Palestinians, although they have been hostile to Israel. And all of this adds up to a grotesque tragedy where the Palestinians can only feel impotent and the fury of helplessness, and the Israelis will feel threatened from, understandably, legitimately, from a millennial hostile power, in Gaza, and it's beyond tragedy. I don't say this to be, literary, but it's all added up to an impossible situation, where the solution now is to massacre Israelis or to obliterate half of Gaza, which I think I did an interview earlier today where I was jumped all over on by the Israelis for suggesting that there probably wasn't an easy military solution a military solution in Gaza, because it's true you could blow up tunnels and seize probably arms caches, and you can kill some people, but gosh, if anyone should have learned anything from our invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, or more broadly, the American approach for 20 years, or at least a dozen, in the quote war on terror, was that you cannot kill your way out of what is a terrorist and an ideological, in this instance even theological, problem. You cannot do it because even if non-members of Hamas, Palestinians who are not members of Hamas, oppose violence and then see the Hamas members killed, the options for trying to advance what you view as your self-interest are zero, just about.
Okay, so what happens now? Gary, over to you. What happens now? What are the scenarios?
Well, it's important to point out that in the case of Hamas, there's no negotiation. Hamas makes it very clear. We mentioned their covenant a number of times. that Hamas is not interested in negotiating with Israel. Their objective is the annihilation of Israel. And so there is no negotiation with Hamas, and there won't be. But
so does that mean the 150 hostages will be killed one by one? Do we expect beheadings on camera?
Well, I mean, I know Hamas has made claims that this is going to happen. In fact, there are now reports that some hostages have been killed in the Israeli bombings of Gaza. No way of verifying that.
Yeah.
But I am very distrustful of Hamas and what they will do with these hostages. At the very least, they will be used as human shields, just as, by the way, Hamas has used the Gazan people as human shields when they set up their facilities beneath schools, mosques, and apartment buildings. These tunnels run right underneath inhabited areas where innocent civilians live. And if Israel is going to go after these and bomb these, they therefore will have to destroy areas where the Gazans live and conduct their everyday lives. And this is purposeful on the part of Hamas.
So it's part of their propaganda war, in a way, because the more the civilians die, the more images of suffering emerges from Gaza, the more it inflames the Arab street, the more it upsets students in Glenn's alma mater, Harvard, who then sign declarations, including Indians, leftist Indians, by the way, not me, that Israel is responsible even for the terrorist attack by Hamas.
Yeah, there's a lot of blame shifting, and that happens in any conflict. I suspect that Hamas is trying to put the burden of the survival of these hostages now on Israel. Well, if they die, it's only because you're not following our rules or our dictates. So I don't have a great deal of hope. I certainly pray that their lives will be saved. Yeah. But I think Israel has determined that they're going into Gaza to eradicate, to the extent that they can, the Hamas leadership, operation, and facilities. And they will make parallel efforts to retrieve the hostages, but they're not going to let the hostages stand in the way of this operation to remove Hamas from Gaza. That's unfortunate, but I think it's probably likely.
So what are the broader implications of this? How does this unravel now in the rest of the Arab world and in the Muslim world? I can tell you, in India, where I come from, I went to university in Lucknow University. I have Muslim friends who are jubilant and quite delighted that Hamas hit one on the chin. And of course, now they are greatly upset and deeply emotional. They've gone from jubilation to trepidation in days that, oh my God, now, they were first delighted that, oh, wonderful that David has hit Goliath and given a great sock on the chin. And now they're saying, look at Israel, it's killing babies and it's killing more people than Hamas did. And white people are never going to call out Israel because Israelis are white, and they are not. The Gazans are never going to get their due because they are Muslim, and the West is not Muslim. So I hear this even in India. It's certainly the narrative in Bangladesh, certainly the narrative in Pakistan, not amongst everyone, but sections of the press. The Arab Street, the Financial Times has an article about this. So I'm very curious as to how does this play out, gentlemen?
I don't think it's going to provoke or lead to much support for Hamas within the Arab world. Certainly not among Arab governments. The Arab Street is something else. And
can we expect an Arab uprising spot 2 inspired by this?
Possible, but I think after the experience of the Arab Spring, all of these governments have strengthened their ability to tamp down that kind of activity. Not that it could not happen. To a certain extent, these governments probably will permit a certain level of public opposition to Israel's campaign in Gaza. I've seen this happen before, and as long as it stays within certain bounds, and very often it does not, governments will tolerate it. But at some point, they will clamp down because it can easily translate into instability, and that's something they cannot tolerate. So they'll contain this, and in some countries they won't permit any of this public demonstration whatsoever. But it's not going to spark any more support for Hamas, and likely even less. As we pointed out earlier, very few governments in the Arab world are sympathetic toward Hamas. But the greater question is, as Glenn pointed out, you're not going to kill this idea, and none of this is going to address the core problem that the Palestinians continue to present not only to the Israelis, but to the world. And that is, we live in occupied territory, or territory under siege in the case of Gaza. We have long maintained we deserve a state. When and how are we going to get it? There was a concerted effort in the 1990s to do that. And unfortunately, I think, and personally, I blame the Palestinians, not entirely, for missing the opportunity they had in 2000 and 2001 when
there's an Israeli politician who said they never miss an opportunity. I'm forgetting which one.
To miss an opportunity in 2000 and again in early 2001, they most certainly did. And
Gary, the Palestinians,
senior Palestinians, subsequently admitted to me, acknowledged, those involved in the negotiations, that they made a grievous error in not accepting, or at least continuing to negotiate, their finer points of what was presented to them in 2000 and 2001, and compounding it by the launch of the Second Intifada, which is what turned this mass movement in Israel away from the peace movement and into confrontation in Israel. And that's really important to understand.
So, Gary, great points, but I just wanted to put the Palestinian point of view, and many left-leaning intellectuals also say that what Israel was offering was really a moth-eaten state. In Israel, all the Jews have the right to return. The Palestinians have suffered Nakba, and basically this was an unfair deal. What do you say to this argument?
You mean in terms of the proposal that was presented to them in 2001?
Yeah, when they missed the boat.
They would have had what was in the West Bank and Gaza. I want to say anywhere between 95 and 97%. And part of that, and it was still under negotiation, would have been land swaps, that is, portions of Israel to the Palestinians in exchange for established settlements that they did not want to uproot in the West Bank. So they would have had the West Bank, and in Gaza with slight modifications to the 1967 border, which we all know. And that was probably the high watermark in terms of opportunity for the Palestinians. I doubt, personally, that they will come close to that in any future negotiations. But the real question is, so what's the address if there is to be future negotiations with the Palestinians? Yes, you would say the PLO and Fatah. Do they represent the Palestinians of Gaza? And there's debate about that. The PLO, I think it was pointed out by both of you, that the PLO and Fatah are not popular in either Palestinian location. So it's unlikely that they would trust anything that was brokered, at least under the current leadership. And that points out the first requirement to move to a genuine solution to this conflict, and that is new leadership on both sides.
Yeah, and that is great you said that, because Israeli coalition politics has become more fractious, more extreme, and there have been cabinet ministers, Glenn and I were discussing yesterday, who've been advocating ethnic cleansing and genocide of Palestinians. So that is a very dangerous trend on the Israeli side. And in fact, both sides have these dangerous trends. Glenn,
it's not the government that's going to negotiate with the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Full stop. They're not. Yeah. Period.
Yeah.
And the question is,
so we have described the various impasses or immovable objects, which are in every direction for any progress. And until there is progress, the other point is the good thinking. I don't want to say right thinking, because that would imply politically to the right. And I'm thinking actually of the left. In the world, certainly in the United States and in Europe, until the Palestinians have their state, that they will be perceived as oppressed victims, and there will be sympathy for the Palestinian cause and hostility towards Israel. And there's sort of no way forward, that, as we all have noted at present.
So we expect a protracted period of uncertainty and tensions. And we can only hope at the moment that once this generation loses power, then perhaps the next one will learn the lessons of this one and make a peace deal.
Well, that's certainly the most hopeful view. And as a former diplomat, it's certainly one that I prefer taking. But, we've had successive generations now that have gone down the path of continued conflict. It's sad and unfortunate, because each generation pays an even greater price, in my view, than the one that came before it. And Glenn has said this, and I'll second it. There is no military solution to this conflict. There simply is not. You're not going to kill an idea here. The only way, for example, that you can dilute and even eliminate the political ideas espoused by Hamas, which are violent, is to have an earnest and sincere negotiation with the side that is willing to do the same, negotiate. That exists. I'm not sure it has the capability now, given the current leadership in the West Bank. They would need a considered renewal of leadership in the Palestinian territories today in order to become a credible negotiator with Israel, and ditto for the Israeli side as well.
On that note, thank you for watching this FO Live. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you like this video, and you leave a comment. If you have ideas, write to us. We'll be back with more FO Lives with our two guests and many more. Thanks a lot from everyone at Fair Observer. Bye for now.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.